Welcome to our discussion on percents. All right, so what exactly is a percent? Well, simply put, I'm sure you all know what a percent is, but what you might not realize is that a percent is in fact a ratio, and it's also a fraction, and it's also a decimal. So that means anytime we are working with percents, we can convert them back and forth to ratios, fractions, and decimals, and work with them that way. Usually probably the more common ways are fractions and decimals, with decimals probably being the most common use. So for instance, we could write these percents as simplified fractions. So instead of 75% off, we can think of that as 75 of 100, because percent means per 100, right? Per means divided by, cent is 100 in Latin, so percent is divided by 100. 75 divided by 100, you take that fraction, you reduce it to 3/4. 6.8, right? Salaries are up. 6.8% is 6.8 over 100. You can think of that as 6 8/10, right? Divided by 100. Or you can make it 6 5/4, which of course 6 5/4 converts to 34/5. Remember when we were dealing with mixed fractions, we always have to convert them into improper fractions first whenever we're doing any kind of multiplying, dividing, really any kind of math with them whatsoever. And then instead of dividing by 100, we think of that as multiplying by 1 over 100. You can, of course, do a little reduction. You can divide 34 and 100 both by 2 to help reduce those fractions before you do the math. But most of you have fancy calculators where you could just multiply those through, hit the little math fraction button, and it'll reduce the fraction, and your answer will be 17 over 250. I don't know how that's any more helpful than 6.8%, but if you had to convert it into a fraction, there you go. So as I said, fractions, decimals, percents, they're all pretty much the same thing. So it's nice to be able to convert back and forth between any of them. If we want to express a percent as a decimal, it's really easy. All we do is shift the decimal places 2 places to the left and then get rid of the percentage symbol. And then of course we want to go in the other direction, go from a decimal to percent. You just shift the decimal places 2 places to the right and add the decimal symbol, right? So that's really easy, going back and forth between those two. If the percent involves a fraction, you want to take that fraction and write it as a decimal if you can. You know, like 1/3 isn't really a decimal, but you can make it 3 repeating, which will help you to actually make the decimal. So there are easy ways to always do this. You can also use your calculator for a lot of this. So let's look at a couple examples. So first, we're going to look at 8%, right? If a decimal point is not shown, it's always understood to be at the right of the whole number. Duh, right? I mean, 8% means 8.000%. So take that invisible decimal point and shift it 2 places to the right. And instead of 8 point, make it 0.08, right? If you move it 1 place to the right, it's right in front of the 8. Sorry, 1 place to the left, it's in front of the 8. A second place to the left, you now have to have a 0 there, and that's where you get 0.08. Lop off that percent symbol, and you just get 8% is 0.08. With 6.8, we do the same thing, only there already is a decimal point there. So we shift it over 2 places, right? And you get 0.068. Now, if we want to do 33 1/3, the decimal point again is understood. We think that it's there after the 1/3, and we can move it to 0.33 1/3, but 1/3 is just 3 repeating, so we just get 0.3 repeating. Last example, 1/2%. Well, you can think of that as 0.5 or 0.5%. Then you can move that decimal 2 places over and get 0.005. All right, so many books are going to give you these big elaborate schemes for how you go back and forth from one to the other. This is one of those reasons why so many students fear and hate math, is because we get too many of these rules to try and memorize, and it's just silly. You guys know how to do a lot of this stuff already. If I gave you a fraction and said make it a decimal, what would you do? You'd slap it in your calculator. Simple, easy, right? So going from fractions to decimals, that's silly. We already know how to do that, so we don't need to worry about some formalized set of words telling me how to do this. Simple. Okay, a fraction to a percent. Well, first thing you're going to do is change it to a decimal, right? It even tells us right here. First thing you do is change the fraction to a decimal. So really what happens is going from fraction to a percent is really going from decimal to percent, right? So this whole thing is what happens for both of these. All that happens is the first thing you do is take your fraction, make it a decimal, which is easy, throw it in your calculator and get a decimal, and then move the decimal places 2 places to the right and put a percent symbol on it. That's a pretty easy thing to do, right? Shifting a decimal 2 places and adding the percent symbol. That's really, really easy. So going from fractions and decimals both to percents is really super easy. And then of course, going from percents to decimals, right? So going from a percent to a decimal, this shift, that's really easy because all we're doing is the opposite of this, right? We shift it 2 places to the left and get rid of the decimal. Okay, well, so now that takes care of the idea of going from a percent to a fraction, because if we can get a percent to a decimal, now all we have to do is get from a decimal to a fraction. And so that kind of puts these two in the same spot. Well, going from a decimal to a fraction is really easy if you have the fancy calculator when you hit the little math fraction button. But if not, then all you have to do is take that decimal and write it as something over a power of 10 and then reduce. So that's also pretty easy. So really it all boils down to, can you move a decimal place left and right and add or subtract a decimal? I'm sorry, add or subtract a percentage symbol. And then can you go from a fraction to a decimal? That's easy, that's in your calculator. And then lastly, can you go from a decimal to a fraction? Well, that just involves putting the decimal number without the decimal over a 1 with some zeros and then possibly reducing. So let's look at a couple examples. Fraction to a percent, right? Well, we take 5/8, we stick it in our calculator, we get 0.625. I mean, you could do the long division, but that's what we all have calculators for. Okay, well, 0.625, that's easy because 0.625, we just move it 2 places to the right, add the percentage symbol, and there we go, 62.5%. So 5/8, 62.5%. All right, how about the next one? Well, 5/6, same thing. Stick it in your calculator, you're going to get 83.33333333333. Yes, you can think of it as 83 1/3, but forget it. It's 83.33333. It's going to be 83.3 repeating percent, and you just need to know that 0.3 repeating is 1/3. So there's your 83 1/3%. Okay, how about decimals as percents and fractions? Well, decimals to percents, remember, are really easy because all you do is move the decimal point, slap on a percentage. Simple. Okay, well, how about changing it to a fraction? Well, you can first make it a percent if you want, but really any number, right, that has a decimal is really a fraction in disguise because it's being divided by 1 with some zeros. You see how there's 2 numbers to the right of the decimal? Then that means we have 85 over 1 with 2 zeros. Now reduce that fraction. Well, they're both divisible by 5, and that's where we get 1720. We can do the exact same thing with this. Yes, it's really easy to change it to a percent because you just, move it twice, slap on the percent, and there we go, 248.5%. But if we wanted to change this to a fraction, well, it's 2485 because there's the number without the decimal, right? You just take away the decimal, and then you have a 1 with some zeros. How many zeros do you have? Well, how many numbers did you have to the right of the 0? 3 of them. So there you go. Reduce that. That's all you got to do every single time. And of course, you can reduce it with simple math. You can reduce it with a calculator. You can reduce it with calculators that do it for you. I mean, it's really simple. Obviously, if any of these things are going to reduce, they're only going to reduce if the top number is divisible by 2 and 5, because that's the only number that goes into powers of 10. Right? Because I don't care how many zeros you put down here, it's really just 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. And 10, we all know, is 2 times 5. So the only numbers that are going to go into this bottom number, no matter how many zeros you have, are going to be 2s and 5s. You might have, a lot of 2's and 5's, but it's just going to be multiple 2's and multiple 5's. So the only way this fraction can reduce is if the top number is divisible by either 2 or 5. Well, 2 is pretty easy. Is it an even number? Yes, then it's divisible by 2. No, it's not. 5 is pretty easy. Does the top number end in a 5 or 0? Yes, then it's divisible by 5. No, it's not, right? So it's that simple. And then, you look at that and go, oh, 2485, that divides by 5. So you take 2485 and you divide it by 5 in your calculator if you have to. And that's where you get, a lower number. And it just reduces and reduces further. And you keep doing that until it's over with. Okay, how about some problems that involve percentages? Well, the kind of most common percentage problems that you're going to see in any kind of algebra class is going to be A is P% of W, right? Something is something percent of something else. We say A because that's the amount, that's the given amount. We use a P because that's a percentage, and we use a W because that's the whole. So for instance, 10 is 50% of 20. 20 is the whole. Isn't 10 half of 20? Yeah, so that's 50%. So 10 is 50% of 20. That's where those names come from. But what really matters, not so much where these names come from, and the amount is oftentimes called the percent. The percent is called the rate. Who cares, right? What matters is, can you translate these things? And can you solve them? Now, there are some things that can help you translate. If you can, it's nice to be able to identify the pieces. So when you look at these questions, you can go, oh, what number is 18% of 20? Well, it's pretty obvious the percent that I have is 18. The whole number is always after the of. So of 200, that's my whole number. And then the amount, that's my what? That's my unknown. Okay, 18% of 200 is what number? All right, well, 18 again is my percent of 200, so 200 is my whole, and then is what number? Again, my unknown is the amount. You can go through the rest of these, right? 150 is 12% of one number. What number, sorry. So 12%, that's the easy part, that's percent. There is nothing after the of, right? Of what number? So the unknown is the of is the whole, and then 150 is, that's the amount. You can go through the rest and see how all these work, but what matters is, can you solve them? Well, again, we've learned techniques for solving equations before. Why do we need to learn a whole new technique for these? This is the same thing. As long as you know how to translate English into math, you can solve this. Some simple things to remember. The word what. What is always your x, right? That's your unknown. Right? So this is x, this is x, this is x. Percent, well, that's always over 100, right? Or per 100. You can also think of it as the percent symbol. Of always means to multiply. Is always means equals. So what number, x, is equals 18% of 200. Can you do that math? Yeah, that's pretty darn easy, right? Okay. 18% of 200 is what number? 150 is 12% of what number? 63 is what percent, right? Percent means divide by 100 of 420. 18% of what number is 72? And finally, 120 is what percent of 60? See how simple that is? All of those things translate very easily into simple equations if we just know the word of is always multiplication, the word is always equals, what, the word what, right, is always what we're looking for. That's our x, that's our unknown. You don't have to use x, by the way. You could use a, p, any letter you want, right? Percent, whether it's the word percent or the symbol percent, always means the same thing. Percent per 100 divide by 100. The reason why we want to do that is we can't do math with 18 with the little percent symbol, but we can do math with 18 over 100. Sorry, that looks like a horrible 100. That looks like 150. That's 100, right? So we have to convert all of our percentages into either fractions or decimals in order to do the math. I like fractions just because they're easy to work with, right? But you could do decimals as well, right? 18 over 100 is just 0.18. Now do that in your calculator. 0.18 times 200 equals x, right? So all of those things can become decimals. It's just a little trickier with x over 100. What do you do with that, right? So that's why I like to leave them as a fraction, because then everything is always the same thing. If I want to solve this thing, I got to multiply both sides by 100 to get rid of the fractions. Or I can reduce my fractions first and multiply by whatever's left over. But in either case, it's pretty easy to solve these things with some simple translation. Okay, if you're curious, here are the solutions to all of those. You can check your work and make sure you got the right answers as well. And that's pretty much everything we need to know for percents.